I am Joshua, 34 years old, and my own family projected my medical history and biggest failures onto a 10-foot screen at my brother's wedding to humiliate me in front of 200 people. Before I tell you how one single text message destroyed my father's empire and ended my brother's marriage, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Millbrook Country Club smelled like expensive gardenias, roasted tenderloin, and old money. I was sitting at table 14, tucked all the way in the back corner right next to the swinging kitchen doors. Every time a waiter rushed out, the heavy wooden door would smack against the wall, rattling my water glass. It was the physical equivalent of being shoved in a closet, which is exactly where my family wanted me. Up at the head table, my younger brother, Elijah, tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The room quieted down, the heavy chandeliers dimmed, and a massive projector screen dropped down behind him. And now, Elijah announced, his voice dripping with that arrogant charm he'd perfected over the years. A little tribute to the family, specifically, my big brother, Joshua. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. I knew they were going to do something. My grandmother had warned me, but I didn't know how far they were willing to go. The screen flickered to life. Up popped an awkward, grainy photo of me from high school. Across the bottom, in massive, bold red letters, the word flashed, high school dropout. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter washed through the room. I kept my eyes locked on the screen. The slide clicked. Another photo, this one from my mid-20s, looking exhausted. The text read, divorced. More laughter. A bit louder this time. The kind of laughter that feeds on someone else's misery. Click. Broke. Click. Alone. Click. Failure. And then came the final slide. The one that made the blood rush out of my head and my hands turn ice cold. It was a cartoon image of a baby with a giant, brutal red X stamped completely over it. The text beneath it was unmistakable. Infertile. My medical history. My deepest, most agonizing private grief. Projected in 10-foot letters for 200 strangers to consume as entertainment. For a second, the room went dead silent. It was the shocked kind of silence, where people suddenly realized they might be participating in something deeply cruel. But then Elijah leaned right into his microphone. His smirk was wide enough to show his perfect, expensive teeth. "Don't laugh too hard, folks," Elijah mocked, feigning sympathy. He might actually cry. That broke the tension. A wave of cruel laughter erupted. I looked at my mother, Vivian. She was sitting gracefully in her custom gown, slowly swirling the red wine in her glass. She didn't look horrified. She looked thoroughly entertained. I shifted my gaze to my father, Harold. He caught my eye from across the massive ballroom, offered a slight, dismissive shrug, and mouthed the words, "Just a joke, son. Lighten up." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't flip my table. I just reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was already glowing with a pre-typed text message addressed to my friend David, who was currently sitting unseen in the AV control booth above the ballroom. The message was exactly one word: begin. I pressed send. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. And I waited, because what they didn't know was that I hadn't come to this wedding as a victim. I came as an architect, and I was about to dismantle their entire lives. To understand how we got to that ballroom, you have to understand how a father decides to throw his 18-year-old son away like garbage. It was a rainy Tuesday night. I was a senior in high school, sitting at our polished mahogany kitchen table. Harold dropped a heavy legal document right in front of me. "Sign it," he demanded. He didn't ask. He never asked. I looked down at the paper. It was a deed transfer for a 2-acre parcel of land sitting right on the edge of Millbrook. It had rolling grass, a small creek, and one massive, ancient oak tree right in the center. My grandmother, Ruth, had given it to me on my 16th birthday. She had looked me dead in the eye, handed me the original deed, and said, "This is your inheritance, Joshua. No matter what happens, this is yours. Keep it." I looked back up at my father. "Grandma gave this to me," I said, my voice shaking just a little. I need that parcel to consolidate the Oakdale commercial project, Harold snapped, tapping his gold pen against the table. She gave it to you, and I am telling you to give it back to me. Now sign the paper, Joshua. I looked over at my mother. Vivian was sitting on the leather sofa in the adjoining living room, casually flipping through a high-end home decor magazine. She didn't even look up. The sound of glossy pages turning was the only thing filling the suffocating silence in that house. I looked at the stairs. Elijah, who was only 14 at the time but already a carbon copy of my father, was standing on the landing, smirking down at me. I pushed the paper back across the table. No, it's mine. The look in Harold's eyes changed. It went from annoyed to absolute, frigid rage. He picked up his phone, dialed a number, and spoke 3 sentences to his wealth manager. Right there, in front of me, he liquidated my college fund. The money he had been saving since the day I was born, gone. Rerouted into his corporate account. You want to be a man? Harold said, leaning over the table so close I could smell the scotch on his breath. Be a man. You walk out that door tonight, you never come back. You get nothing from me. Ever. I didn't argue. You can't argue with a brick wall. I went upstairs, packed exactly 1 canvas duffel bag with my clothes, and grabbed the keys to my beat-up 1998 Honda Civic. When I walked out the front door, the rain was coming down in sheets. I had $43 in my checking account. I was completely terrified, but as I started the engine and drove away from that massive, suffocating house, the only thing I felt was a strange, hollow sense of clarity. They didn't love me. They only loved what they could control. The next day, Harold told the neighbors and his country club buddies that I had dropped out of school, gotten involved with a bad crowd, and run away, breaking my poor mother's heart. In a town like Millbrook, where my father's wealth bought the truth, his version of the story was the only one that mattered. He branded me a failure before my adult life even started. I was the family disgrace, and for a long time I actually believed it. The reality of being 18 and homeless hits you the hardest around 3 in the morning, when the cold seeps through the floorboards of your car and your bones ache from sleeping in the driver's seat. For the first 3 weeks, my Honda Civic was my bedroom, my dining room, and my closet. I parked in the far corners of 24-hour supercenter parking lots, praying the security guards wouldn't knock on my window. I got a job working the graveyard shift at a grimy gas station just off the interstate. I spent my nights mopping floors that smelled permanently of bleach and stale beer, ringing up truckers and counting out pennies for my own meals. Every morning, I would wash my face in the rusted sink of the station's public bathroom, staring at my bloodshot eyes in the scratched mirror, promising myself that this wasn't going to be the end of my story. Since I had been forced out of high school just months before graduation, the very first thing I did with my gas station paychecks was pay for a GED prep course. I studied at the counter between ringing up customers. I read history and math textbooks under the flickering fluorescent lights until my eyes burned. I got my GED. Then I enrolled in the local community college. To pay for tuition, I picked up a second job waiting tables at a diner where the grease seemed to permanently attach itself to my skin. I took 18 credits a semester. I didn't go to parties. I didn't have weekends. I just worked, studied, and slept. Eventually, my grades were good enough to get a need-based scholarship to the university's architecture program. I chose architecture because I wanted to learn how to build things with a solid foundation. Things that couldn't be blown down or taken away just because someone signed a piece of paper. Those years were brutal. They stripped me down to the studs, but they also rebuilt me. When I was 23, I graduated. The ceremony was held on a massive green lawn under a bright, cloudless sky. Thousands of parents were there, cheering, holding balloons, snapping pictures of their kids. When they called my name, I walked across the wooden stage, shook the dean's hand, and took my diploma. The crowd clapped politely, but there was no specific cheer for me. I looked out into the sea of faces, just instinctively searching for my mother or my father. But of course, they weren't there. They hadn't spoken to me in 5 years. After the ceremony, I didn't go to any graduation parties. I drove back to my tiny, cramped studio apartment. I took off my cap and gown, ordered a cheap pepperoni pizza, and sat on the bare floorboards by myself. I looked at the piece of paper in my hand. It was just paper, but it was mine. I had bought and paid for it with my own sweat, my own hunger, and my own absolute refusal to be the failure Harold Linden said I was. I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I thought that by building my career, I was building a fortress around my heart. I didn't realize that the deepest wounds were still waiting for me, and that the desperation to be loved would lead me straight into another nightmare. By the time I was 25, I had a decent job as a junior draftsman at a commercial firm. Outwardly, I was doing great, but inwardly, I was carrying a massive, invisible void. I just wanted a family. I wanted somewhere to belong. That desperation made me the perfect target for Chloe. I met Chloe through an old college buddy. She was stunning, polished, and carried herself with an air of absolute authority. At first, her attention felt like love. She planned our dates, picked out my clothes, and told me how to style my hair. I thought she just cared about me. But within a year of us getting married, the walls started closing in. Chloe wasn't a partner. She was a warden. She scrutinized my bank statements. She alienated me from my coworkers by throwing fits if I stayed late at the office. If I didn't answer a text within 5 minutes, my phone would blow up with accusations. I had married a younger, female version of my father. I was trapped in a glass cage, walking on eggshells in my own home. The final straw came when we started trying to have kids. Chloe was obsessed with the idea of a perfect family portrait. When a year passed with no success, she dragged me to a fertility clinic. I will never forget sitting in that sterile, white doctor's office. The specialist looked at my charts, sighed, and delivered the news. A severe medical complication from a childhood illness I'd never had properly treated. The final verdict was absolute. I was infertile. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I was devastated. But Chloe, she didn't comfort me. She didn't hold my hand. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. Within a week, she filed for divorce. She told me I was defective and a waste of her time. The divorce was ugly, but finalizing it felt like I could finally breathe again. I was 28, living alone again, carrying a secret shame that I felt made me less of a man. During my darkest weeks post-divorce, my cousin Julian reached out. Julian was Harold's nephew, the one guy in the family who occasionally texted me to check in. He came over to my apartment one night with a 6-pack of beer. He sat on my couch, threw his arm around me, and told me I wasn't alone. In a moment of sheer vulnerability, fueled by alcohol and desperate for a brotherly connection, I broke down. I told Julian everything. I told him about Chloe's cruelty, the divorce, and the devastating infertility diagnosis. Julian hugged me. He told me my secret was safe with him. He told me I was still a good man. I trusted him. I actually thought someone in my bloodline cared about my well-being. I didn't know that Julian was drowning in gambling debt. I didn't know that right after leaving my apartment, he drove straight to Harold's house and sold my deepest, most painful secrets to my father and Elijah in exchange for a $50,000 bailout loan. He handed them the ammunition they would eventually use to execute me in public. I spent the next 6 years burying myself in my work. I changed firms, moved to a different city, and climbed the ladder until I became a senior architect at Mercer and Hollis. I built a life that was quiet, successful, and entirely mine, until the phone rang. Part 2.4, Bong Toi Troy Day, 615 words. It was exactly 4 weeks before Elijah's wedding. It was 11 p.m. on a Thursday. I was sitting at my drafting table in my home office, reviewing elevation plans for a massive historic renovation project, when my cell phone buzzed. The caller ID showed an unknown number from Millbrook. My stomach instantly dropped. I hadn't had a call from that area code in years. I answered hesitantly. "Hello, is this Joshua Linden?" A woman's voice asked. She sounded professional, careful. "Speaking. My name is Dolores. I'm a nurse at Shenandoah Hills Care Center. Your grandmother, Ruth, asked me to call you." My grip tightened on the phone. Grandma Ruth was 84 years old. She was the only person in that town who had ever treated me like a human being. The only one who told me to keep that land. Is she okay? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. She's stable right now, Dolores replied, her voice softening. But she needs an extensive hip replacement surgery in 3 weeks. At her age, the anesthesia risks are significant. She has been asking for you every single day, Joshua. She cries for you. I closed my eyes. The guilt washed over me like a heavy tide. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. The last time I tried, I had sneaked into the facility, but someone tipped off Harold. He threatened to move her to a facility across the country if I ever showed my face there again. I stayed away to protect her. I'll be there tomorrow, I said instantly. Wait, Dolores interrupted, her tone dropping to a hushed whisper. Joshua, there are strict instructions at the front desk. Your father put you on the banned visitor list. But he left a message. He told the facility director that you are only allowed to see Ruth if you attend your brother's wedding first. It's his condition. The sheer cruelty of it took my breath away. Harold was using an 84-year-old woman facing a potentially fatal surgery as a hostage. He was using my grandmother as bait to drag me back into his circus, just so he could play the role of the benevolent patriarch who successfully gathered his whole family for a photo op. There's something else, Dolores whispered, sounding genuinely frightened. Your grandmother told me to warn you. She said Elijah and your mother are planning something for the wedding reception. Something aimed at you. She said they have a presentation. She wanted me to tell you to be ready. The line went quiet. I stared blankly at the blueprints on my desk. They weren't just demanding my presence. They were setting a trap. They wanted to drag the family failure out of the shadows, put him on display, and punish him for daring to survive without them. Tell her I'll be there, I said to Dolores, my voice turning to steel. Tell her I love her, and tell her not to worry. I hung up the phone. I looked around my quiet, beautifully furnished home. I looked at the framed architectural awards on my wall. I wasn't the scared 18-year-old kid shivering in a Honda Civic anymore. I wasn't the broken, divorced guy crying on a couch. I was a man who tore down crumbling structures and built strong ones for a living. If my family wanted to play games with my grandmother's life, I would play. But I was going to bring a sledgehammer to their glass house. The next morning, I walked into the downtown offices of Mercer and Hollis. I poured myself a black coffee and went straight to my glass-walled office. I couldn't focus on the blueprints. The impending wedding and the threat against my grandmother were echoing loudly in my skull. I needed to think, but more importantly, I needed an ally. I looked through the glass wall and saw David. David was 36, a former Army IT specialist who now ran the tech infrastructure for our entire architectural firm. He was built like a linebacker, had the technical skills of a hacker, and was the most unflappable human being I had ever met. We had bonded over late-night server crashes and endless cups of terrible office coffee. He was the closest thing I had to a real brother. I knocked on his door frame. He pulled off his noise-canceling headphones. You look like you just watched a ghost burn down your house. What's wrong? I walked in, shut the door, and closed the blinds. I sat down and poured everything out. I told him about the ultimatum, the hostage situation with my grandmother, and the ominous warning about a presentation at the wedding reception. David leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He processed the information like a tactical threat. So you're walking into a public execution, David said flatly. If I don't go, he blocks me from seeing Grandma Ruth before her surgery. I have to go. Okay, David nodded, cracking his knuckles. Then you don't go in blind, and you definitely don't go in unarmed. If they are using a presentation, they're using projectors. If they're using projectors, they need an AV crew. David spun his chair around to his multi-monitor setup. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Within 10 minutes, he had pulled up the event schedule for the Millbrook Country Club. Look at this, David grinned, pointing at the screen. They outsourced the event tech to a local Millbrook AV company. And guess what? The company posted an urgent listing on a freelancer board 2 days ago. They are short-staffed for the weekend of your brother's wedding. They need a freelance board operator. I stared at him. David, you can't be serious. You'd spend your weekend in Millbrook doing tech support at a wedding? I'm not doing tech support, Josh, David said, his voice dropping into a serious, protective register. I'm running Overwatch. I am going to have direct access to the projector system, the soundboard, and every USB drive they plug into that computer. If they try to humiliate you, I'll have the kill switch right at my fingertips. He clicked his mouse, submitting his application with a fake local address and his very real, very impressive military tech resume. If they fire the first shot, David said, looking me dead in the eye, we make sure the barrel explodes in their face. 45 minutes later, David's phone rang. He was hired on the spot. We had our man on the inside. I felt the first real surge of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I wasn't the scared kid anymore. I was a strategist and I was bringing in the cavalry. Now, I just had to survive the mandatory family dinner to secure my visitation rights at the nursing home. 3 weeks before the wedding, I made the 2-hour drive back to Millbrook. Harold had demanded a family dinner to discuss my behavior at the upcoming wedding before he would lift the ban at the nursing home. Pulling into the driveway of the massive, colonial-style house made my chest tight. Nothing had changed. The manicured lawns, the pristine white columns, it was the exact same facade hiding the same toxic rot inside. I knocked on the heavy oak door. My mother, Vivian, opened it. She was dressed in a tailored silk blouse, holding a crystal wine glass. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my plain gray suit. You look thin, she said, offering no hug, no warmth. Are you eating? I suppose living alone takes its toll. I'm fine, Mother, I said evenly, stepping inside. The house smelled like lemon polish and old resentment. We moved to the dining room. Harold was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, exactly where he sat 16 years ago when he threw me out. Elijah was lounging to his right, wearing a designer polo shirt, holding hands with a stunning blonde woman. This was Isabella, the bride-to-be. Joshua, Harold said, not looking up from his steak. Sit. Let's get this over with. I sat at the far end of the table. For the first 20 minutes, I was entirely ignored. The conversation was dominated by Elijah bragging about his recent promotion at Harold's real estate firm, a promotion he undoubtedly didn't earn. And Isabella's parents are flying in their private chef for the rehearsal, Elijah boasted, kissing Isabella's cheek. It's going to be the event of the decade. The Whitmore family doesn't do anything halfway. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. Whitmore? I looked at Isabella. Your last name is Whitmore? Isabella smiled politely, clearly having been told a dozen lies about the estranged, unstable brother. Yes, my father is Richard Whitmore. My mother is Eleanor. Elijah let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Don't act like you know them, Josh. They operate in a completely different stratosphere than whatever it is you do. What are you doing these days, anyway? Still drawing floor plans for strip malls. I looked at my brother. I looked at my father, who was smirking into his wine glass. They truly believed I was nothing. They had spent 16 years convincing themselves that casting me out had ruined me. I manage fine, I said quietly, taking a bite of my steak. Harold pointed his steak knife at me. Listen to me closely. The Whitmore family is old money. They are bringing millions in investments into this town. If you do anything to embarrass us at this wedding, if you talk about your sad little divorce, or if you bring up your medical shortcomings, I will make sure you never see your grandmother again. Do you understand me? The cruelty was so casual it was almost breathtaking. They really were going to use my infertility as a weapon. Julian really had sold me out. I understand perfectly, Harold, I said, dropping the title of Dad. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my career. I just finished my meal, wiped my mouth, and left. As I drove back toward Richmond in the dark, my mind was racing. Whitmore, the name echoed in my head. Couldn't just be a coincidence. I needed to get back to my office. Fast. I didn't go home. I drove straight back to the Mercer and Hollis building, badged in at 1 a.m., and booted up my workstation. The glow of the monitors illuminated my dark office. My heart was pounding against my ribs as I opened the firm's master client database. I typed in the name, Whitmore Heritage Foundation. The search results loaded instantly. For the past 8 months, I had been the lead architect on a multimillion-dollar restoration project. We were converting an abandoned Civil War-era textile mill in Millbrook into a sprawling, state-of-the-art community arts and cultural center. It was the biggest project of my career. The entire development was being solely funded and overseen by the Whitmore Heritage Foundation. I scrolled down to the primary client contact, Eleanor Whitmore, chairwoman of the board. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen in absolute disbelief. Eleanor Whitmore was Isabella's mother, the woman whose daughter my brother was marrying. Eleanor and I had exchanged over 100 emails. We had sat through a dozen long conference calls discussing structural integrity, historical preservation, and budget allocations. She respected my vision. She trusted my expertise. She knew exactly who Joshua Linden, senior architect, was on paper and over the phone. But we had never actually met in person. Our firm's partners handled the physical meet and greets, while I ran the project from the technical side. To Eleanor Whitmore, I was just a brilliant voice on a speakerphone and a signature on a blueprint. She had no idea what I looked like. And more importantly, she clearly had no idea that the brilliant architect she hired was the estranged, disgraced son of the family her daughter was marrying into. I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed in the empty office. My father thought he was marrying into a family that was leagues above me. He thought the Whitmores would look down on me. He had no idea that his future in-laws were currently paying my salary and trusting me with their legacy. A dangerous, exhilarating thought crossed my mind. I had the ultimate trump card sitting right here in my email inbox. With one phone call to Eleanor, I could expose Harold's lies. I could ruin Elijah's wedding before it even started. But as I sat there in the quiet hum of the server room, I shook my head. No, I wasn't going to strike first. I wasn't Harold. I didn't use power to crush people just because I could. I was going to give them a chance to just let me attend the wedding in peace. But if they pulled the trigger, if they actually tried to publicly humiliate me on that projector screen like Grandma Ruth warned, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would let them destroy themselves in front of the most important people in their lives. I locked my computer, grabbed my keys, and walked out into the night. The board was set. 2 days later, Harold called the front desk of Shenandoah Hills Care Center and officially cleared my name for a single supervised visit. I drove straight to the nursing home. The hallways smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. My mother, Vivian, was already there, sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside the room. She didn't look up from her phone. "You have 30 minutes, she said coldly. "Don't upset her." I pushed the door open. Grandma Ruth was sitting up in bed. She looked much smaller than I remembered. Her white hair was thin, and her hands trembled, but her eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, were exactly the same. "Joshua," she breathed, reaching out with both hands. I sat on the edge of the bed and wrapped my arms around her. "I'm here, Grandma. I'm right here." She pulled back and studied my face, her thumb gently tracing my jawline. "You look strong. You look like a man who built himself." "I'm trying," I smiled, holding her frail hands. Her expression suddenly turned serious. She glanced toward the closed door, making sure Vivian wasn't listening. "Did Dolores warn you about the reception?" "She did," I whispered. "I'm ready for it. Don't worry about me." "They want to break you, Joshua," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a fierce, gravelly whisper. "Harold is terrified of you because you survived without him. You proved he wasn't God." She slowly reached under her pillow, her hands shaking as she pulled out a crumpled, faded envelope. She pressed it firmly into the palm of my hand. "What is this?" I asked. "Dolores helped me get it from my safety deposit box," Ruth whispered. "Harold pays a lot of money to the staff here to keep tabs on me. But Dolores is loyal to me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a legal property deed. It was the deed to the 2-acre Oakdale parcel. I scanned the document, my eyes widening as I reached the bottom line. The property was still registered under the name Joshua Linden. I don't understand, I stammered, looking up at her. Harold took this. He said he consolidated it for the Oakdale development 16 years ago. He lied, Ruth said, a bitter smile crossing her lips. He tried to forge it. He tried to find legal loopholes. But my lawyers were better than his. He never got the land, Joshua. It has been yours this entire time. He just told the town it was part of his development to save face. He has been building a house of cards on land he doesn't own. My mind spun. 16 years. 16 years of believing my father had stolen my inheritance, when in reality, my refusal to sign that paper had actually worked. Harold had been projecting power he didn't possess. Take it, Ruth commanded, squeezing my fingers. When the time comes, you show them exactly who owns the ground they stand on. Before I could say another word, the door swung open. Vivian stood there, tapping her luxury watch. Time's up, Joshua. Say your goodbyes. I folded the deed, slipped it into my inside jacket pocket, and kissed my grandmother's forehead. I'll see you after the surgery, I promised. As I walked out of that nursing home, patting the pocket holding the deed, I realized I held 2 massive tactical nukes. The Whitmore connection and the Oakdale deed. The storm was coming, and I was holding the lightning. It was the Thursday night before the wedding. I was sitting at the kitchen island in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen. David was sitting across from me, a slice of cold pizza in one hand and a wireless mouse in the other. We were building my retaliation. We keep it clean, Josh, David said, clicking through the presentation software. No name-calling, no insults. We don't stoop to their level. We just hit them with cold, hard, verifiable facts. I nodded. Just the truth. The truth is sharp enough. Slide 1. A photograph of me at my university graduation. I was standing alone in my cap and gown in front of the architecture building, holding my diploma. The text beneath it was simple. Nobody came to my graduation. I went anyway. Bachelor of Architecture. Slide 2. A high-resolution scan of my framed state architectural license. Licensed architect, Commonwealth of Virginia. Slide 3. A photo of me on a massive construction site, wearing a hard hat, unrolling blueprints on the hood of my truck with the skeletal frame of a multi-million-dollar courthouse rising behind me. Senior architect, Mercer and Hollis. Slide 4. A scan of the Oakdale property deed Grandma Ruth had given me. I highlighted my name and the date. Legal owner, 2-acre Millbrook parcel. Never surrendered. Okay, David said, taking a bite of pizza. That handles the dropout and broke narrative. What about the final slide? The big closer. I thought about the group chat message Grandma Ruth had warned me about. I thought about the sheer lack of empathy it took to mock a man's infertility. Make it a black screen with white text, I said quietly. David typed as I dictated. The measure of a family is not how they celebrate their best. It is how they treat their most vulnerable. David sat back and looked at the screen. He nodded slowly. It's a kill shot, Josh. If they play their garbage presentation and I override the system with this, there is no walking back. You are burning the bridge, the village, and the surrounding forest. They burned the bridge 16 years ago, David, I replied, staring at the screen. I'm just clearing the ashes. David exported the presentation onto a sleek black USB drive. He tossed it to me across the counter. I'll be at the country club at 8 a.m. on Saturday to set up the AV booth. I'll patch my laptop directly into the main projector feed. I'm giving you a dedicated phone number. You text that number, and my script automatically kills their feed and runs your slides. It'll take less than 3 seconds. I picked up the USB drive. It felt incredibly heavy for such a small piece of plastic. I pulled out my phone, opened a new message to the number David provided, and typed the word, Begin. I'm not going to press it unless they force me to, I said, almost to myself. I'm giving them one last chance to be decent human beings. David looked at me with a sad, knowing smile. Josh, guys like your dad and your brother, they don't know how to be decent. They only know how to be loud. Make sure you're louder. I put the phone in my pocket. The ammunition was loaded. Now I just had to walk into the crosshairs. The wedding day arrived with a clear, crisp blue sky. The kind of perfect weather that rich people always seem to be able to buy. I drove my modest sedan up the winding, oak-lined driveway of the Millbrook Country Club. The valet line looked like a luxury car dealership. I watched as valets scrambled to park gleaming Rolls-Royces, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and Porsches. The Whitmore family's social circle had descended upon the town, bringing their immense wealth with them. I handed my keys to the valet, adjusted my dark gray suit, and walked through the heavy double doors into the grand foyer. The reception ballroom was breathtaking, in a suffocating kind of way. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings. The tables were draped in heavy white silk, covered in towering arrangements of white roses and orchids. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner. I checked the seating chart near the entrance. Joshua Linden, table 14. I navigated through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Table 14 wasn't just in the back. It was practically out of the room. It was shoved into the far back corner, directly adjacent to the kitchen doors. My table mates were a few elderly distant cousins who clearly had no idea who I was, and two empty chairs. I sat down. Every few minutes, a waiter would burst through the kitchen doors, bringing a blast of heat, clattering dishes, and the smell of roasted meat. I was entirely separated from the rest of the family. Up at the front, table 1 was a display of absolute dominance. Harold was working the room, holding a glass of scotch, slapping backs, and laughing loudly. He was in his element, playing the role of the successful patriarch merging his empire with the Whitmore dynasty. Vivian was floating from table to table, her smile practically glued to her face, accepting compliments on her dress. Elijah and Isabella were seated at the center of the head table. Elijah looked incredibly smug, leaning back in his chair like a king surveying his subjects. To their right sat the Whitmores. Richard Whitmore looked dignified and quiet. Beside him sat Eleanor. I watched Eleanor Whitmore carefully. She looked regal, composed, and highly observant. She sipped her water, her eyes scanning the room, analyzing the dynamics. She was the woman I had spent months designing a cultural center for. She was the one holding Harold's future in her hands. And she had absolutely no idea the architect she trusted was sitting 20 yards away, exiled next to a kitchen door. "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through my thoughts. Vivian appeared at my table. She leaned down, her perfume overwhelming the smell of the kitchen. "You're hiding in the back." "Good," she whispered, keeping her social smile plastered on so no one else would know she was scolding me. "Remember what your father said. Keep your head down. Do not speak to the Whitmores. Do not embarrass us. Eat your food and leave quietly after the cake is cut." Before I could answer, she spun around and glided back toward the head table. I looked up toward the AV booth suspended above the back of the room. Through the tinted glass, I could barely make out the silhouette of David, wearing a black tech polo, giving me a subtle thumbs up. I took my phone out of my pocket. The screen glowed. The message "Begin" was still queued up. I placed it face up on the table next to my water glass. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the clowns to start the circus. The word "infertile" burned on the 10-foot screen. The harsh white light illuminated the faces of the 200 guests sitting in the grand ballroom. The laughter that had started as a low, uncomfortable rumble quickly morphed into something vicious. People were leaning across their tables, pointing at the screen, whispering behind their hands, and looking back at table 14 to catch my reaction. Up at the head table, my brother Elijah was practically glowing. He held his champagne flute against his chest, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. This was his masterpiece. He had taken my deepest medical trauma, a secret I had only shared in a moment of absolute vulnerability, and turned it into the punchline of his wedding reception. Beside him, my mother Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. Her eyes met mine across the room. There was no pity in her gaze. There was only the cold satisfaction of a woman watching a pest being eradicated. Harold stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and raised his hands to calm the crowd. He wore the practiced, benevolent smile of a politician. "Just a joke, son," he called out to me, his voice booming over the speakers. "Lighten up. We all have our shortcomings." I didn't move. I didn't break eye contact with my father. My phone was resting face down on the white linen tablecloth in front of me. I had just pressed send. One word. Begin. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. The frantic, terrified beating of my heart suddenly smoothed out into a steady, powerful rhythm. I wasn't trapped anymore. The cage door was open. 3 seconds passed. Elijah leaned back into the microphone to deliver his next insult. "Now, let's move on to the actual successful members of the massive projector screen behind him abruptly flickered and went pitch black. Elijah tapped the microphone. "Hello? Can we get the tech guys to fix the screen?" Up in the AV booth, my friend David had completely locked the system. He had bypassed the local event staff's computer, isolated the projector feed, and locked out the manual controls. Nobody in that room could stop what was coming next, short of taking an axe to the main power line. A sharp, digital chime echoed through the ballroom speakers, cutting through the murmurs of the confused guests. The screen flared back to life, but it wasn't Elijah's presentation anymore. The background was stark, unforgiving black. The text was a crisp, brilliant white. The first slide appeared. It was the photograph of me standing alone on my university campus, holding my diploma. The text beneath it was massive and impossible to misinterpret. "Nobody came to my graduation. I went anyway. Bachelor of Architecture." The laughter in the room died instantly. The silence that replaced it was heavy, thick, and incredibly tense. A woman at table 6 lowered her wine glass, her mouth slightly open. Before anyone could speak, the slide clicked to the next image. It was a high-resolution scan of my framed state license. Licensed architect, Commonwealth of Virginia. The whispers started. Not mocking whispers this time. Confused, shocked whispers. People were looking from the screen to Harold, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the head table. Click. The third slide appeared. A vibrant, wide-angle shot of me standing on a massive commercial construction site, wearing a hard hat, unrolling blueprints with a towering steel framework behind me. Senior architect, Mercer and Hollis. "Turn it off," Harold barked, his country club facade cracking completely. He waved frantically at the AV booth. "Cut the power. Right now." Up in the booth, David sat completely still, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the chaos unfold. Click. The fourth slide. The Oakdale property deed. The document Harold had claimed he possessed for 16 years. My name was highlighted in bright yellow. Legal owner, 2-acre Oakdale parcel. Never surrendered. A collective gasp swept through the room, primarily from the local Millbrook businessmen who knew exactly what the Oakdale project was. Harold had built his recent reputation on that land consolidation. Seeing proof that he didn't own the central parcel was like watching a bomb detonate in the middle of a bank. Harold's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He abandoned the head table and started marching toward the back of the room, his fists clenched. Then, the final slide locked onto the screen. The measure of a family is not how they celebrate their best. It is how they treat their most vulnerable. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I stood up. I stepped out from behind table 14. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I walked at a steady, measured pace toward the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me like water. Harold intercepted me halfway down the aisle. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep. "You ungrateful little punk," he hissed, his voice trembling with sheer rage. "I will destroy you for this. You are ruining your brother's wedding." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. Then I looked him dead in the eye. "Take your hand off me, Harold." Something in my voice, the absolute lack of fear, made him freeze. He slowly released his grip. "You spent 16 years telling this town I was a dropout," I said, projecting my voice so the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "You stole my college fund. You told everyone I was a broke failure. You let your other son put my medical records on a screen to humiliate me. You don't get to demand respect when you've spent a lifetime acting like a monster." "It was a joke," Vivian cried out from the head table, her voice shrill and desperate. She was clutching her pearl necklace. "Joshua, you are being hysterical. Stop making a scene in front of the Whitmores." At the sound of her name, Eleanor Whitmore stood up. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stepped out from behind the head table. She didn't look at Harold. She didn't look at Vivian. She walked straight toward me, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. She stopped 3 feet away from me. She looked at the giant screen displaying the Mercer and Hollis architectural logo, and then she looked at my face. "Joshua Linden?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," I replied respectfully. Eleanor turned slowly, her gaze sweeping over Harold, Vivian, and finally resting on Elijah. "Mr. Linden," Eleanor said, addressing my father. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The man you just publicly humiliated, the man you called a failure, is the senior architect I hired to design and oversee the Millbrook Heritage Project." Harold's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take over. "He is managing a $15 million development for my family's foundation," Eleanor continued, her voice echoing in the silent room. "He has more talent, integrity, and professionalism in his little finger than I have seen from your entire family this evening." Vivian sank back into her chair, her face completely drained of color. Elijah looked like he was going to be sick. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. "Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey." Elijah scrambled out from behind the table. He rushed over to his bride, Isabella, grabbing her hands. "Baby, listen to me, he's lying. Joshua is just jealous of my promotion. He's trying to ruin our day because he's a miserable, divorced loser." Isabella looked at the screen, then at Elijah, and finally at me. She pulled her hands out of Elijah's grasp. "He didn't make that first slideshow, Elijah. You did. You sat in our apartment for 3 nights giggling over those photos. You told me your brother was a crazy addict who refused to get help. You told me he abandoned your family." "He did," Elijah pleaded, his voice cracking. "He was 18 years old," Isabella shouted, her voice breaking with genuine horror. "And you made fun of him for being infertile? What kind of sick, twisted people do that?" Isabella grabbed the heavy silk skirt of her wedding dress and stepped away from him. She looked at her father, Richard Whitmore. Richard gave a single, definitive nod. Eleanor turned her attention back to Harold. "We entered into preliminary discussions regarding the Oakdale Commercial Partnership based on your assurance that you owned the necessary land and that your family operated with integrity." Eleanor gestured toward the screen showing my property deed. "You lied about your assets, and you have thoroughly demonstrated your lack of integrity. There is no Oakdale Partnership, Harold. The Whitmore Foundation will not do business with a man who treats his own blood like dirt for entertainment." Harold stumbled back a step. His entire empire, built on the promise of the Whitmore money, was evaporating right in front of his eyes. "Eleanor, please, let's go to my office. We can discuss this privately." It's just a family misunderstanding. I have the lawyers on standby to finalize the Oakdale contracts. Cancel your lawyer, Richard Whitmore spoke up for the first time. His voice was deep and completely devoid of emotion. We are done here. The domino effect was immediate. The Whitmores were the social and financial anchor of Millbrook. Once they signaled their departure, the rest of the room followed suit. The wealthy investors, the country club board members, the local politicians, they all started standing up. Chairs scraped. Purses were grabbed. Men adjusted their ties and looked anywhere but at Harold. I watched as the valet line outside turned into a chaotic traffic jam of Rolls-Royces and Porsches trying to flee the toxic fallout of the Linden family. My Uncle Thomas, Harold's older brother, stood up from table 4. He was a quiet, stern man who usually avoided family drama. He walked over to Harold, shook his head in absolute disgust, and pointed a finger at his chest. You broke that boy, Harold. And tonight, he finally showed everyone what you really are. Don't ever call my house again. Thomas walked out, taking his entire side of the family with him. Within 10 minutes, the massive ballroom was mostly empty. The remaining guests were awkwardly hovering near the exits. The jazz quartet had quietly packed up their instruments and slipped out the back. I stood in the center of the room. Harold was staring at the floor, his breathing ragged. Vivian was crying softly at the head table, mourning the death of her social status. Elijah was begging Isabella, who was taking off her veil and handing it to her bridesmaid. I reached into my suit jacket, pulled out the physical, folded copy of the Oakdale deed, and walked over to Harold. I tossed the paper onto the floor right at his expensive leather shoes. You wanted my inheritance, Harold? I said softly. You can look at it, but you can never build on it. Stays empty. A monument to your greed. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. I turned my back on my father, my mother, and my brother. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, my head held high, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. When I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, I took the deepest breath of my entire life. I was completely, unequivocally free. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled. Or rather, the Linden family empire had completely crumbled into dust. I didn't have to seek out the news. It found its way to me through David, who kept a close eye on the Millbrook business forums. Harold's real estate firm took a catastrophic hit. Without the Whitmore partnership and the Oakdale land, his primary investors panicked and pulled their funding. He was forced to sell off 2 of his major commercial properties just to pay his staff's salary and avoid bankruptcy. The man who had defined himself by his wealth was suddenly struggling to keep his office lights on. Vivian's fall from grace was even more severe, at least in her eyes. The Millbrook Country Club elite function on strict social currency. After the wedding, Vivian became a pariah. She was quietly removed from the charity boards. Her weekly luncheons were canceled. When she walked through the local grocery store, people literally turned their shopping carts around to avoid making eye contact with her. She had spent her life cultivating an image of perfection, and now she was the town's most famous cautionary tale. As for Elijah, Isabella annulled the marriage within 30 days. She packed her bags, moved back to her parents' estate, and cut all contact. Elijah lost his fake promotion at Harold's firm because the firm could no longer afford his inflated salary. He was 30 years old, living back in his childhood bedroom, stripped of his golden boy status. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, sketching out the courtyard details for the Whitmore Heritage Project, when my cell phone rang. It was Harold. I almost let it go to voicemail, but a strange sense of calm washed over me. I wasn't afraid of his voice anymore. I answered. Joshua, Harold said. His voice sounded thin, exhausted, and remarkably old. We need to talk about the Oakdale land. I am willing to buy it from you, above market value. Name your price. I need that parcel to secure a new loan. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the city skyline. The land isn't for sale, Harold. It will never be for sale. Joshua, please, Harold's voice cracked. a hint of genuine desperation bleeding through. You have your revenge. You ruined my business. You ruined your brother's life. Isn't that enough? Why do you have to be so stubborn? It's just a piece of dirt. It was just a piece of dirt 16 years ago, I replied evenly. But you chose that dirt over your own son. You made your bed. Now sleep in it. You wouldn't even know how to hold a grudge this long if it wasn't for Julian. Harold suddenly snapped, his anger flaring up to cover his panic. He told me you were broken. He told me about your divorce, about the clinic. He came to me asking for a handout, begging for money for a lawyer for his custody battle, and he sold you out to get it. He said you were weak. I just used the information he gave me. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Julian, my cousin, the one guy who sat on my couch, drank my beer, and told me I was a good man. He hadn't just accidentally let my secret slip. He had weaponized my medical history and sold it to my father to pay his own legal fees. A year ago, that betrayal would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression. I would have questioned my own sanity and isolated myself from the world. But right now, sitting in my beautiful office, holding the blueprints of my own success, I just felt a profound sense of closure. Thank you for telling me that, Harold, I said quietly. What? Will you sell me the land? No, I'm never speaking to you again. Consider this a funeral for our relationship. I hung up the phone. I blocked his number. Then I found Julian's number in my contacts and blocked him too. I excised the last remaining pieces of the infection. My life didn't just move forward. It accelerated. The Whitmore Heritage Project broke ground the following month. Eleanor Whitmore and I stood side by side with silver shovels, smiling for the local press. She never brought up the wedding incident, treating me with nothing but the utmost professional respect. She judged me by my work, and my work was flawless. When the architectural firm evaluated my performance, they didn't just give me a bonus. The senior partners offered me a massive promotion, making me a junior partner in the firm. I had a corner office, a salary that allowed me absolute financial security, and a team of brilliant designers working under me. But the best part of the aftermath had nothing to do with architecture or money. It was Grandma Ruth. Her hip replacement surgery was a complete success. Without Harold interfering and controlling the visitor list, I took over her care management. I hired a private physical therapist. I visited her 3 times a week. On a bright Sunday afternoon, I drove my car up to the Shenandoah Hills Care Center. I walked in, greeted Dolores at the front desk with a box of pastries, and went to Grandma's room. She was sitting in a sturdy armchair, dressed in a bright yellow sweater, waiting for me. Ready to break out of here? I asked, offering her my arm. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I thought you'd never ask. I helped her into my car, and we drove out of Millbrook. We didn't talk about Harold, Vivian, or Elijah. We talked about her garden, my new office, and the terrible coffee they served at the nursing home. We drove to a small diner on the edge of the county, ate cherry pie, and watched the cars drive by. She was safe, she was loved, and she was entirely mine to protect. A year has passed since the wedding. Today, I am standing on the 2-acre parcel of land in Oakdale. The dirt beneath my boots is damp from the morning rain. The massive oak tree in the center of the property is shedding its autumn leaves, painting the ground in vibrant shades of orange and gold. I unroll a set of heavy blueprints and lay them out on the hood of my truck, securing the corners with a few stones. It's a design for a house, not a massive, cold, colonial mansion with heavy oak doors and silent, suffocating rooms. It's a modern, open-concept home. It has massive glass windows to let the natural light pour in. It has a wraparound porch overlooking the creek. And on the ground floor, it has a custom-built, fully accessible guest suite with wide doorways and a walk-in shower. A permanent room for Grandma Ruth, for whenever she decides she's tired of the nursing home and wants to live with me. I look at the lines on the paper. Every measurement, every angle, every support beam is a testament to survival. My family tried to bury me. They tried to take my money, my reputation, and my dignity. They thought that by stripping away the title of son and brother, they would leave me as nothing. They didn't realize that I am an architect. When you tear down a flawed structure, you don't cry over the broken bricks. You clear the lot, pour a stronger foundation, and build something beautiful in its place. I don't have a wife right now. I don't have biological children to pass my name down to. And I don't have a relationship with my parents or my brother. But as I stand on this land, feeling the cold autumn wind against my face, I know one thing for absolute certain. I am not a failure. I am not broke. And I am definitely not alone. I have built a life that is entirely unapologetically mine. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a heavy one, but getting it out into the world feels like laying the final brick on a very long road. I hope this resonated with you in some way, maybe reminding you that your worth is not defined by the people who refuse to see it. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to walk away from people you loved to save yourself? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your experiences. Before you go, if you watched this video all the way to this exact moment, I want you to drop the letter W in the comments. The W stands for winner. That's our secret code for the 1% Club, the incredible group of people who stick around to the very end of the journey and refuse to let the hard times break them. If I see a W from you, I'll know exactly who you are. Please don't forget to hit the like button and follow the channel. We are building a community here, one story at a time, and I want you to be a part of the next one. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.